The morning I found my mother-in-law's scarf hanging on my coat rack was not the morning I finally broke. I remember standing in my entryway, still in my work shoes, briefcase in hand, staring at that pale yellow scarf like it was a flag someone had planted in foreign territory. I knew whose it was, I knew exactly whose it was, and I knew she had not been invited. But I told myself it was fine. I told myself she probably just stopped by to drop something off. I told myself a lot of things that year that I no longer believe. My name is Claire, I'm 31 years old. I work as a medical billing coordinator for a hospital network in Charlotte, North Carolina. I live, or I used to live, in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building called Whitmore Place, on a quiet street lined with crepe myrtle trees that bloom pink every summer. I moved there 2 years after my husband Daniel and I separated. Not divorced, separated. That distinction mattered a great deal to my mother-in-law, Margaret, because in her mind, separated meant temporary. It meant the door was still open. It meant she still had standing. And standing, to Margaret, meant access. I want to explain something before I go any further, because the first question anyone asks when they hear this story is always some version of, "Why did you let it get this far?" It's a fair question. I've asked it myself. Usually at 2 in the morning when I'm lying in the dark, replaying every decision I made, looking for the exact moment I should have drawn a harder line. The honest answer is that when you spend 5 years inside a marriage where someone else's comfort is always treated as more urgent than your own, you stop trusting your instincts about what's normal. Margaret had been in my life for 6 years by the time I moved out. 6 years of her rearranging my kitchen when she visited, of her commenting on my grocery choices, of her telling Daniel I seemed stressed and maybe I needed to slow down at work. 6 years of her love, which was real, and her control, which was also real, and the two of them wound so tightly together that I could never quite pull them apart. When Daniel and I separated, I thought the hardest part would be the loneliness. I was wrong. The hardest part was Margaret. She did not take the separation quietly. She called me 3 times the first week, then twice a day for the 2 weeks after that. She told me she was worried. She told me Daniel was a mess. She told me that marriages go through rough patches and that what Daniel and I had was worth fighting for. And every time she said it, I felt the walls of her concern closing around me like a room with no windows. I was patient with her. I was kinder than I probably needed to be. I gave her my new address because she asked for it, and because at the time I thought I actually believed that having it would give her some peace of mind. She was worried. I understood that. I gave her the address the same way you hand someone a glass of water, because they're thirsty. I did not think it would become a key. I was wrong about that too. The first time it happened, I was at work. I came home on a Wednesday evening to find a casserole dish on my kitchen counter, still faintly warm, covered in foil, with a Post-it note stuck to the top. Thought you could use a home-cooked meal. Hope you're eating. M. My building had a secure entrance. You needed a key fob to get into the lobby. The only way she could have gotten in is if another resident held the door for her, or if she had followed someone in and smiled the right way. Margaret was very good at smiling the right way. I texted her and said thank you, and I put the casserole in the refrigerator, and I sat on my couch for a long time thinking about how she had been alone in my apartment. Going through my kitchen, looking at my things, knowing the layout of my space. I told myself she meant well. That was the story I used that time. The second time, she left flowers. Pink dahlias in a vase she must have brought from her own house, set on my kitchen table with another note. These always cheered me up after hard days. This time, I was more unsettled. I texted her again, warmer than I felt. And then I called the front desk of my building and asked whether anyone had been signed in as a guest for my unit. The concierge, a young man named Trevor who worked the day shift, apologized and told me that a woman had come in saying she was my mother and that she had groceries for me, and that he had let her up. He said she seemed very nice and very concerned. I thanked him without letting my voice go cold, and then I sent an email to my building's property manager explaining that no one was to be granted access to my unit without my prior written approval. I asked for it to be noted on my account. I received a confirmation email the next day. I thought that would be the end of it. 3 weeks later, I came home to the smell of lemon cleaning spray, I stopped in my doorway the same way you stop when something in the air is wrong but you can't yet name it. My apartment smelled clean in a way it hadn't when I left. The kind of clean that is someone else's version of clean. I walked through the room slowly, the way you do in a dream, and I noticed things. The throw blanket on my couch had been refolded. The stack of books on my coffee table had been straightened and reorganized. I could tell because the novel I was currently reading was no longer on top. The dish rack in my kitchen held 2 mugs and a plate that I had left unwashed in the sink that morning. And in the corner of my bathroom, next to the toilet, sat a small wicker basket that had not been there when I left. Inside the basket, a spare roll of toilet paper, a box of tissues, and 3 travel-sized bottles of lotion that smelled like lavender. She had cleaned my apartment. She had reorganized my things. She had decorated my bathroom. She had a key. I sat on the edge of my bathtub and held that basket in my hands for a long time. I was not angry yet. That came later. What I felt in that moment was something closer to vertigo, the floor tilting under a truth I had been slow to see. She had not gotten in through the lobby this time. The building had my instructions on file. She had a key to my front door, and the only way she could have a key to my front door was if Daniel had given her one, or if she had made a copy from the one I had given him when we were still sharing a life together. I called Daniel that evening. He was quiet when I told him what I'd found. He said he didn't know anything about a key. I asked him if he had given her mine. He said no. I asked him if there was any chance she had access to his copy. Another long silence. Then, she did house sit for me last month when I was in Raleigh for work. She would have had access to my keys then. His voice was careful and tired in the way it got when he was caught between 2 people he loved and didn't know how to protect either of them. I told him what I needed from him was simple. I needed her not to have that key anymore. He said he would talk to her. I told him I needed more than a conversation. He said he understood. I don't think he understood. Because 6 days later, on a Saturday morning when I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop, trying to get through a backlog of work emails, I heard the sound of a key in my front door lock. I want to be precise about what that sounds like, because I have thought about it many times since. It is not loud. It is a small, metallic, intimate sound, a sound that should belong to you alone in the space that is yours. When you hear it made by someone who has not been invited, it lands somewhere below the chest in a part of the body that is older than language. The door opened. Margaret stepped in carrying a tote bag and a smile. She stopped when she saw me. For a single second, her expression flickered. Not guilt, exactly, more like recalculation. Then the smile reassembled itself and she said, "Oh good, you're home. I brought you some things from the farmer's market. I wasn't sure if you'd be up yet." I closed my laptop. I set down my coffee. I looked at her standing in my open doorway with her tote bag and her smile, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. I told her to come in and close the door, which she did, looking pleased that I hadn't made a scene. She set the tote bag on my kitchen counter and started unpacking it. Peaches, a jar of honey, a small bunch of basil, narrating each item as she placed it, telling me the peaches were particularly good this week, asking if I'd been sleeping, mentioning that Daniel had seemed better lately. Did I think there was any chance we might try counseling? She knew a wonderful therapist who had helped a couple she knew from church. I let her finish. I let her say everything she wanted to say. And then I asked her, very quietly, where she had gotten the key. She paused with a jar of honey in her hand. She said Daniel had given her one a while back for emergencies. I asked her what emergency this was. She said she didn't need an emergency. She was family. I asked her to put the key on the counter. She looked at me for a moment like I was being unreasonable, the way she had always looked at me when I set a limit she didn't like. Then she set the key on the counter next to the honey. I told her that I needed her to understand that coming into my home without my permission was not something I would allow to continue, regardless of what key she had access to. I told her that if she came to visit, she needed to call first, wait for an invitation, and wait for me to open the door. I told her that my apartment was my private space and that it was not negotiable. She told me she understood. She said she just worried about me. She said she hoped I knew her heart was in the right place. I said I knew that. I walked her to the door. That evening, I changed the locks. I paid the building's maintenance fee. I bought a new deadbolt with a keypad, and I changed the code to something only I knew. I felt better for about 2 weeks. Then I started noticing other things. Small things at first. A bottle of vitamins on my bathroom counter that I didn't remember buying. A different brand of dish soap under my sink. My thermostat set 3 degrees warmer than I keep it. Each one small enough to doubt myself over. Each one just plausible enough to explain away. I began taking photos of my apartment before I left in the mornings. My counter, my table, my bathroom, the thermostat. I kept them in a folder on my phone with dates and timestamps. I did not want to be someone who doubted her own memory. I wanted evidence before I trusted my instincts. 2 weeks into the system, I came home to find my thermostat at 74 degrees. I had left it at 68. I checked my photos. 68 degrees, time-stamped 8,047 a.m. She had a way in that I hadn't found. I went through my apartment methodically. I checked every window. I checked my back door, which opened onto a small utility balcony shared with the adjacent unit, and there it was, a window latch on the balcony door that did not fully catch, a gap just wide enough, and a balcony that a determined person could access from the fire escape stairwell at the end of the hall with a key that fit an older common lock. I want to say I confronted her again. I want to say I called Daniel and demanded more than understanding, but I had been in this pattern long enough to know what confrontation got me. It got me apologies that dissolved like sugar in warm water. It got me promises that lasted until the next time. It got me her grief and his guilt and my own exhaustion, and nothing actually changed. I had changed the lock on my front door, and she had found a different way in. She was not going to stop. She was going to keep finding ways in because, in her mind, the love she felt entitled her to the access she wanted, and no lock I put on any door was going to change the way she thought about that. So I stopped trying to change the way she thought about that. So I started making a different plan. I did not tell Daniel. I did not tell my friends because one of them was also friends with Margaret, and I didn't trust the information to stay contained. I told one person, my coworker Deb, who is 62 years old and has a practical wisdom I have relied on more times than I can count. I told Deb the whole story one afternoon during our lunch break, and she listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Baby, you need to disappear." She did not mean it dramatically. She meant it the way you mean it when you're describing the only solution to a problem that has been handled every other way. She meant, you need to be somewhere she doesn't know about, in a space she has never touched, with a door she has never had a key to. I started looking for a new apartment the next day. I found one within 3 weeks. A 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building in a different part of the city, a building with a key fob entry, a building where I would not be known, where no concierge had ever been charmed by a woman with a tote bag and a concerned expression. I paid the security deposit and the first month's rent. I signed the lease under only my name. I arranged for a moving company to come on a Thursday morning, which was a day I knew Margaret had her standing bridge club and Daniel had an early meeting in Durham. I scheduled it carefully. I chose the day the way you choose every detail of something you've decided must go right. I did not forward my mail to the new address immediately. I had already set up a P.O. box 3 weeks earlier, and I updated my important accounts, bank, employer, insurance, quietly and well in advance. I went through the list of places that had my address and changed them one by one, in the evenings, with the focused patience of someone who understands that thoroughness now means safety later. The Thursday came. The movers arrived at 8 in the morning. They were efficient and quiet, and they were done by noon. I walked through my old apartment one last time, empty now. Just bare walls and the indentations in the carpet where my furniture had been. I turned in my keys to the management office. I did not leave a forwarding address on file. I updated my contact information with the building to a P.O. box. I drove to my new apartment. I carried in the last box myself. I sat on my couch in a space that was entirely mine, that had never been entered without my permission, that smelled like fresh paint and the particular silence of an undisturbed place. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't fully realized was still clenched. I turned off my phone. I left it off until the next morning. When I turned it back on, there were 43 missed calls. There were calls from Margaret, from Daniel, from Daniel's sister, and, this one surprised me, from a number I didn't recognize that turned out, when I listened to the voicemail, to be a Charlotte police officer asking me to please return the call when I had a moment, as there had been an incident at my former address. I called the officer back. She was professional and kind. She explained that the previous evening a woman had been found in my former apartment, or what the woman had believed was my apartment, and that the new tenant, who had moved in only 4 days after I vacated, had called 911 when they returned home to find an unfamiliar woman in their kitchen unpacking a tote bag. Margaret had apparently used the utility balcony entry. The new tenant did not know her. The new tenant had every right to be alarmed. Officers had responded and Margaret had been detained, questioned, and ultimately released after the situation was clarified. But the new tenant was understandably upset, and there was a report filed. The officer asked me to verify that I had indeed vacated the apartment and that I had not given the woman permission to enter. I confirmed both things. She thanked me and said I might be contacted again if the new tenant chose to pursue anything further. I thanked her and ended the call and sat for a moment with my phone in my lap. I thought about Margaret standing in someone else's kitchen, holding a tote bag, facing 2 police officers, having to explain herself. I thought about how she must have felt when she realized the apartment was different. New furniture, unfamiliar smells, someone else's things in the cabinets. The moment the story she'd told herself about what she was doing finally ran out of room to stand. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired in the particular way you feel tired when something that should have been simple took years longer than it needed to. I felt a kind of grief for the version of my relationship with her that might have existed if she had understood earlier that caring about someone does not give you claim over their space, their privacy, their right to a life that belongs entirely to them. Daniel called me that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail the first time. The second time I picked up, he was not angry. He sounded like someone who had just sat with an uncomfortable truth for several hours and was still deciding what to do with it. He said he was sorry. He said he should have done more when I asked him to handle it. He said he hadn't known how bad it had gotten. I told him I believed that he hadn't known, and I told him that the not knowing had been part of the problem. He was quiet after that for a long time. He asked if I would tell him where I was living now. I told him I needed some time before I was ready to share that. He said he understood. And this time, the way he said it, I thought he actually did. In the weeks that followed, I set up my new apartment with a deliberateness that felt almost ceremonial. I chose where every piece of furniture went. I bought a lamp I had wanted for 2 years and had never bought because I knew Margaret would have an opinion about it. I rearranged the living room twice, for no reason except that I could, and that every choice in that space was mine. I got a plant, a pothos, forgiving and easy, and set it on the windowsill where the afternoon light came in golden and warm. My mornings changed. I noticed this slowly, then all at once. I woke up at my own pace. I made coffee the way I liked it. I moved through my own kitchen without scanning for evidence that someone else had been there. The vigilance I had carried for months, the photos, the timestamps, the constant low-grade alertness, it didn't disappear overnight. Habits built from necessity don't dissolve quickly. But it loosened, degree by degree, like a muscle finally allowed to unclench. I started therapy that fall, not because anyone told me to, and not because I thought something was wrong with me, but because I had spent a long time inside a dynamic that had taught me things about myself I wanted to understand better. My therapist is a practical woman who asks good questions and does not let me get away with half answers. One of the first things she said to me after I told her the story was, "You didn't leave because you gave up on the relationship. You left because you finally chose yourself." I have turned that sentence over in my hands many times since. I think it's true. I think it took me longer than it should have to believe I was allowed to. Margaret did reach out to me once, about 2 months after everything happened. A letter, handwritten, which surprised me. She said she had been thinking about what she had done and that she was sorry. She said she had not understood where the line was, and she was beginning to understand now. She said she hoped that someday we could find a way back to something, if I was willing. I read the letter 3 times. Then I set it on my kitchen table and let it sit there for several days while I figured out how I felt. What I felt eventually was this: I believed she meant it. I also believed that meaning something and being capable of sustaining the change it requires are not always the same thing. What I needed going forward was not her apology. It was her consistency. And that was something only time would tell me, not a letter. I wrote back. I told her I had received her letter and that I appreciated it. I told her I was not ready to resume contact, but that I was not closing the door permanently. I told her that if she wanted to rebuild something, it would have to start with patience, hers, not mine. I sealed the envelope. I walked it to the mailbox at the end of my street. Then I walked back to my apartment, took off my shoes at my own front door, and went inside. The plant on the windowsill had grown 2 new leaves. The afternoon light came in the way it always did. Everything in that space was exactly as I had left it.